Afghan people had been killed and displaced. The US-led coalition invaded Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks because the then Taliban government refused to hand over the al-Qaeda leader. Despite a massive manhunt and a $50 million bounty on his head, bin Laden is still at large. Alex, I know you were wanting to jump in after our other two guests had given their views of the tapes.
Well,
now's your chance.
I think to answer some of the points, I think it's extraordinary the idea that some people in Europe, the public in Europe, might have some kind of support for Osama bin Laden, simply because they may have criticisms of what happened in Iraq, criticisms of America, or indeed criticisms of Israel. You've got to separate the message, in a sense, and the messenger. The European public have no time for Osama bin Laden because they've seen the kind of terror that he can inflict on their own citizens.
But do they have
Madrid,
any time
for
George Bush? I mean, 5 million marched in Italy against the war, 2 million in Britain, 500,000 in Germany, many millions across other parts of Europe.
I think there's a lot of criticism of George Bush, sure, but you know, there's got to be some kind of middle ground between George Bush and Osama bin Laden. I mean, you know, surely we can find a way through. And I mean, you know, the situation in Afghanistan is clearly being damaged by al-Qaeda, the same as happening in Iraq. You know, this is al-Qaeda killing Muslims for what end and for what purpose?
So what do you think his end game is?
Well, I think if you look at what he said, I mean, the end game seems to be the installment of some kind of medieval theocracy across the world, which A, is something I would not support at all, and B, I think is entirely unachievable, even if you did support it.
Just comment about a few things here. First of all, the message is not telling the European public, elect me, telling your elected officials with your ideology, with your Christian background, with your human rights background, are not doing you the best service according to your point of view. It's not going to establish any theocracy or monocracy or anything in Europe. You have your own life, but don't interfere in our life. Secondly, without being now abusive, I think Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair are worse criminals. If Osama bin Laden is a criminal, they are worse criminals. You have seen the B-52 unloading tons of bombs on everyone and everything in Afghanistan, killing on Iraq, killing tens, hundreds of thousands of people. That doesn't compare in numbers. In numbers doesn't compare to what happened in the World Trade Center. Independent of it is positive or negative. But I'm stressing now, he's trying to tell the European public, your interest is not to be with the United States. You have to make your destiny by yourself. You should stop your leaders from being puppets of the US. That's the message. Not for any theocracy or monocracy. What we do in our own realm is our own affair. We will manage our own affairs the better way.
And what's going to happen if his message is ignored?
It will be then, obviously, the evaluation will be that even the public is behind its governments, and there will be a hostile reaction in a longer term. It will make the war goes longer. It's going now for years. It may continue for a decade or a decade and a half against the United States.
So is that going to translate on more terrorism in the streets of the West?
Not necessarily. It may translate in more unity of the Mujahideen in Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe possibly other actions in other places. It may translate also, we have seen, for example, Sabta and Malila being semi-inflamed almost recently, that may inflame. There are many sore points the West should recognize and work on it. And also, we may have action also in some Western countries, because Osama bin Laden's point of view is very clear. You cannot dump on us thousands of tons of bombs, and you don't expect us to send 1 or 2 planes against one of your buildings. Come on, people. Which kind of justice is that? This is not acceptable.
But there is a moral difference, surely, between the deliberate targeting of civilians and the accidental targeting of civilians. Surely there is a difference. I mean, al-Qaeda judges its success on how many civilians it kills.
Yeah,
that's a successful operation. For the Americans and the British.
The deliberate targeting of civilians has been initiated and developed and perfected by the West. They targeted themselves in the World War II and banned whole cities, deliberately targeting civilians. And they targeted Muslim civilians before even bin Laden was born. He's just doing the reaction, saying, you have done that to us, we'll do it to you until you cease and desist. So we are not going now in the morality. Let's just discuss the reality of this.
So Osama bin Laden is responding to what happened to Germany during World War II. It doesn't make any sense.
No, he's in part because he's also part of the humanity. He has the right to respond in behalf of the Germans if the Germans have been subdued by a puppet government according to his point of view. But independent of that, Muslims have been targeted Iraq, for example, the sanctions have deliberately been, for example, in the war, we know that the bombing raids in the war of 1991, in the so-called liberation of Kuwait, the American airplanes and Saudis participated, unfortunately, that they bombed the sewage facilities in Mosul. So what's the purpose of bombing a sewage facility in Mosul, except to spread disease and kill civilians? It's a deliberate target.
If I can bring...
there's so much mess and filth there. Only the media is not covering it properly. But the internet is starting to get that out, and one day it will reach everyone. And some people will be really appalled to see that.
Every time Osama releases any tape, I'm sure that the whole world are involved to study every word. And the European people are well aware of that through think tanks, through politicians, through intelligence services. Even the military study what Osama is saying word by word.
Well, it has to be...
To the extent, Yvonne, that they believe that he is giving through these messages an indirect direction and the guidance to the other Al-Qaeda members everywhere in the world.
So do you think that the messages should not be broadcast?
No, I'm not saying that. It should be broadcasted, but it should be understood in its proper context, and by people who know the mentality of Al-Qaeda, the mentality of Osama, and the meaning of the words, because he is speaking it in Arabic. He's not saying it in English. So sometimes we put more stress on words that have no significance, and sometimes we do not put stress on significant words. And that's why I'm saying the analysts in the West and many think tanks are not the proper ones to understand what Osama bin Laden is saying.
Also, I would just suggest something for our friend here, because he's also from a think tank.
I'm sorry to say so, of course, but this is...
The moment you start with an analysis, with declaring some action to be terroristic or not, you have lost the analysis. The way it says is military or violent action. This is a neutral term. Because the moment you use terrorism, you have already invoked a certain moral qualification, and you get stuck then in a certain vision. Yes, everyone has his moral background, but this will be then a political response or a propaganda, not a philosophical or intellectual analysis. For example, when I report the story that Winston Churchill was upset that some people in the British Parliament criticized him for using not nerve gas, but I think it was mustard gas, against some rebellious Kurds in the north of Iraq in the 1920s,